What would you do if the love of your life vanished without a trace? And when you finally saw her again, she stood beside two children who looked exactly like you. Stay with this story, because what happens next will leave you speechless. If you enjoy emotional, twist-filled stories, make sure to watch until the end. The rain hammered against the windshield with relentless fury as Alexander Harrington's sleek black Mercedes glided through the downtown streets of Manhattan. The storm had descended without warning, transforming the city into a blur of gray shadows and streaming water. Alexander barely noticed the weather, his mind preoccupied with the quarterly reports his assistant had forwarded during his meeting with the Japanese investors. Harrington Tech's latest artificial intelligence platform had exceeded all projections, and yet the triumph felt hollow, as most of his victories did these days. He was 35 years old, worth more than $300 million, and utterly alone in ways that money could never fix. The leather interior of his car smelled of expensive cologne and success, but it couldn't mask the emptiness that had settled into his bones over the past 6 years. 6 years since she had vanished from his life without explanation, leaving only a brief resignation letter and a void that no amount of work or wealth could fill. The traffic light ahead turned red, and Alexander eased his foot onto the brake, his Mercedes coming to a smooth stop. He reached for his phone, intending to check his messages, when movement on the sidewalk caught his attention. A woman stood beneath the inadequate shelter of a bus stop, her arms wrapped protectively around two small figures pressed against her sides. The rain had soaked through her thin jacket, plastering her honey-blonde hair against her face and shoulders. Something about her posture struck him as familiar, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her obvious discomfort. She was looking down at the children beside her, and even from this distance, Alexander could see the tender concern in her expression as she tried to shield them from the worst of the downpour. Then she lifted her head, scanning the street for an approaching taxi, and Alexander's world tilted on its axis. Emma Collins. The name exploded through his consciousness like a thunderclap, drowning out the sound of rain and traffic and his own thundering heartbeat. It was impossible, yet undeniable. Those delicate features, the curve of her cheekbone, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear with slender fingers. He had memorized every detail 6 years ago during the 8 months she had worked as his executive secretary, during the 3 passionate months they had been lovers before she disappeared. His hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The shock of seeing her after all this time paralyzed him, rooting him to the driver's seat even as his mind screamed at him to move, to go to her, to demand the answer she had denied him for so long. But it was the children that truly shattered his composure. 2 boys, identical in every way, stood on either side of Emma. They couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, dressed in matching blue raincoats that were already soaked through. One of them looked up at his mother, and Alexander's breath caught in his throat. The child's face was a perfect miniature of his own, the same strong jawline that Alexander had inherited from his father, the same straight nose, the same shape to his eyes. Even from across the street, Alexander could see the resemblance that no one could possibly mistake. And when the second boy turned his head, laughing at something his brother had said, Alexander saw his own childhood reflected back at him with devastating clarity. The car behind him honked impatiently. The light had turned green, but Alexander couldn't move. His entire body had gone numb with shock, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. Those were his sons, his children. The mathematical certainty of it crashed over him like a physical blow. Emma had been pregnant when she left. She had been carrying his babies, and she had never told him. The honking grew more insistent, and Alexander forced himself to pull forward, his movements mechanical as he guided the Mercedes to the curb. He parked haphazardly, not caring about the meter or the no parking sign, his attention fixed entirely on the small family huddled at the bus stop. Emma still hadn't seen him. She was crouched down now, adjusting one of the boys' hoods, her lips moving in what he imagined were words of comfort and reassurance. The maternal tenderness in her gestures made his chest ache with a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't begin to untangle: longing, anger, grief, and something fiercer that might have been love or might have been rage. He stepped out into the rain, barely feeling the cold water that immediately soaked through his expensive suit. The storm had emptied the streets of pedestrians, leaving them relatively alone on this stretch of sidewalk. Alexander walked toward them with measured steps, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. Emma straightened up, still focused on her sons, still unaware of his approach. She was thinner than he remembered, her face more careworn, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and struggles he knew nothing about. She wore no jewelry except for a simple watch, and her clothes, though clean and neat, had clearly seen better days. The contrast between her current circumstances and a life she might have had, should have had, with him struck him like a physical blow. One of the boys noticed him first. The child's eyes, Alexander's own dark blue eyes, widened with curiosity as he watched this tall stranger approach through the rain. He tugged on Emma's sleeve, and she turned, following her son's gaze. The color drained from Emma's face the moment she saw him. Her lips parted in shock, and her arms instinctively pulled the boys closer to her sides in a protective gesture that cut Alexander to the core. Did she think he would hurt them? Did she think so little of him? For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the rain-soaked sidewalk, 6 years of silence and separation stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Alexander could see 1,000 emotions flickering across Emma's expressive face. Fear, guilt, defiance, and something that might have been longing before she shuddered it away behind a mask of careful neutrality. The boys looked between their mother and this stranger with the innocent curiosity of children who sensed something important was happening but couldn't quite understand what. They pressed closer to Emma, their small hands gripping her jacket, their faces mirrors of each other and of Alexander himself. Alexander found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by emotion and shock. The rain continued to pour down around them, plastering his dark hair to his forehead, running in rivulets down his face. He wanted to say so many things, to demand explanations, to rage at her for keeping this secret, but what emerged was something simpler and more fundamental. He spoke her name, just her name, and the sound of it seemed to break whatever spell had frozen them in place. Emma flinched as though he had struck her, and her arms tightened around the boys. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, clearly struggling to find words adequate to this impossible situation. The twins were watching him now with open fascination, their young faces showing no fear, only curiosity about this tall man who had appeared in the rain and made their mother look so strange. One of them, Alexander couldn't tell them apart yet, tilted his head in a gesture so familiar it made Alexander's breath catch. He had seen that exact expression in photographs of himself as a child, the same thoughtful consideration before asking a question. Emma finally found her voice, and it trembled despite her obvious effort to keep it steady. She didn't deny anything, didn't pretend not to know him, didn't try to claim the boys were someone else's children. The resemblance was too obvious, too undeniable. Instead, she simply stood there in the rain with her sons pressed against her sides, looking at Alexander with eyes full of fear and resignation and something that might have been regret. Alexander took another step closer, and Emma took a corresponding step back, her protective instincts overriding everything else. The movement sparked something in him, anger, perhaps, or hurt that she would think he posed any threat to his own children. His own children. The reality of it still hadn't fully sunk in, but it was there, undeniable and overwhelming. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the boys were shivering now despite their raincoats. Alexander could see Emma's maternal concern warring with her obvious desire to flee from this confrontation. She glanced down the street, clearly hoping for a taxi that would provide an escape, but the storm had driven most cabs off the roads. Alexander made a decision. He gestured toward his Mercedes, parked just a few feet away, its sleek lines and tinted windows promising warmth and shelter from the relentless rain. He told Emma they needed to talk, that the boys were getting cold, that he had a car right there, and could take them wherever they needed to go. Emma shook her head immediately, her refusal automatic and vehement. She started to back away, pulling the boys with her, but one of the twins, the one on her left, was coughing now, a wet, rattling sound that made Alexander's newly awakened paternal instincts flare with alarm. He pressed his advantage, not cruelly but firmly, pointing out that the boys were soaked through and getting sick, that whatever issues existed between him and Emma, their children's welfare had to come first. The word felt strange on his tongue. Children, his children, but also somehow right, as though some part of him had been waiting 6 years to claim it. Emma's resistance crumbled in the face of her son's obvious discomfort. She looked down at the coughing boy, then at his brother who was shivering violently, and Alexander saw the exact moment she made her decision. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she nodded once, a sharp, reluctant gesture that spoke volumes about how much this concession cost her. Alexander moved quickly before she could change her mind, opening the rear door of the Mercedes and standing back to let Emma usher the boys inside. They scrambled in eagerly, their young faces lighting up at the warm, dry interior and the soft leather seats. Emma followed them, her movements stiff and reluctant, positioning herself between the boys as though she could shield them from whatever came next. Alexander closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side, his mind racing. He slid behind the wheel and started the engine, cranking up the heat to combat the chill that had settled over his passengers. In the rearview mirror, he could see Emma's reflection, her face pale and drawn, her arms still wrapped protectively around the boys. He asked for her address, and after a long pause, Emma gave it to him in a voice barely above a whisper. The neighborhood she named was far from the upscale areas of Manhattan, a working-class section of Queens that Alexander rarely had reason to visit. The knowledge that she had been living there, struggling to raise his sons alone, while he had been searching for her in all the wrong places, filled him with a complex mixture of guilt and anger. The drive through the rain-soaked streets was silent except for the boys' occasional whispered comments to each other. Alexander caught fragments of their conversation in the mirror. They were wondering who he was, why Mommy seemed so scared, whether they were in trouble. Their voices were sweet and high, completely innocent of the magnitude of this encounter. Emma shushed them gently, her voice tender despite the tension radiating from every line of her body. She told them everything was fine, that this was just a kind man giving them a ride home, that they would talk about it later. The lie, or perhaps the careful omission of truth, made Alexander's jaw tighten, but he said nothing. This was not the time or place for the confrontation that was surely coming. He focused on driving, navigating the familiar streets that gradually gave way to less familiar territory. The buildings grew shorter, the storefronts more modest, the cars parked along the curbs older and more worn. This was a world away from the penthouse apartment Alexander called home, from the gleaming towers of Harrington Tech, from everything his life had become. The boys had stopped shivering now, warming up in the heated car. One of them, Alexander desperately wanted to know their names, leaned forward to examine the car's interior with wide-eyed wonder. He pointed out features to his brother, his excitement evident despite Emma's gentle admonition to sit back and be still. Alexander found himself studying them in the mirror whenever traffic allowed, cataloging every detail, searching for pieces of himself and pieces of Emma in their small faces. They had his eyes and jawline, but Emma's delicate bone structure and the shape of her mouth. Their hair was darker than Emma's blonde, but lighter than his own black, a rich brown that caught the light when they moved. They were beautiful. His sons were beautiful, and he had missed 5 years of their lives. 5 years of first words and first steps, of birthdays and holidays, of all the precious moments that could never be reclaimed. The loss of it threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed the emotion down, focusing instead on the road ahead and the conversation that awaited them. Emma directed him to a modest apartment building, its brick facade weathered by time and city grime. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it was clearly struggling, the kind of place where people worked hard just to keep their heads above water. Alexander pulled up to the curb and killed the engine, and the silence that fell over the car was heavy with unspoken words and 6 years of secrets. The boys seemed to sense the tension now, their earlier excitement fading into uncertainty. They looked at their mother, then at Alexander, their young faces troubled. Emma unbuckled them from their seats with practiced efficiency, her movements quick and purposeful, clearly eager to escape the confines of the car and the proximity to Alexander. But Alexander wasn't ready to let them go. Not yet. Not without some assurance that this wouldn't be the last time he saw them. He turned in his seat to face Emma directly, and the fear in her eyes when she met his gaze made his heart clench. She thought he was going to take them from her. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He spoke carefully, keeping his voice low and controlled despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. He told her they needed to talk, really talk, not here in the... If this story has your heart racing already, tap like, so we can bring you more gripping stories. Car with the boys listening, but soon, very soon. He needed answers, needed to understand why she had kept this from him, needed to know his sons. Emma's response was barely audible, but she nodded, acknowledging the inevitability of the conversation ahead. She gave him her phone number, her fingers trembling slightly as she entered it into his phone. Then she gathered the boys and opened the car door, ushering them out into the rain that had finally begun to lighten. Alexander watched them hurry toward the building entrance, Emma's arms around both boys, sheltering them as best she could. At the door, one of the twins turned back to look at him, raising a small hand in an uncertain wave. Alexander raised his own hand in response, and something in his chest cracked open at the simple gesture. Then they were gone, disappearing into the building, and Alexander was alone in his expensive car in a neighborhood that felt like another world. He sat there for a long time, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind replaying every moment of the encounter, every expression on Emma's face, every glimpse of the sons he hadn't known existed until an hour ago. The rain had stopped completely now, and weak sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. Alexander started the engine and pulled away from the curb, but he knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. His carefully ordered life, his business empire, his plans for the future, all of it had been rendered meaningless in the space of a single rainy afternoon. He had sons, 2 beautiful boys who carried his blood and his features. And he had found Emma again, the woman who had haunted his dreams for 6 years, who had disappeared with his heart, and he now knew, with his children growing inside her. As Alexander drove back toward Manhattan, toward his empty penthouse and his successful but hollow life, he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would be part of his sons' lives. He would understand why Emma had kept them from him. And perhaps, if fate was kind, he would find a way to build the family that should have been his all along. The city lights were beginning to flicker on as dusk approached, and Alexander Harrington drove toward an uncertain future, knowing only that he could never go back to the man he had been before this day, before he had seen his own eyes looking back at him for the faces of 2 small boys standing in the rain. Alexander barely slept that night. He lay in his king-size bed in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city lights cast shifting shadows across the pristine white surface. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. Noah and Ethan. He had learned their names from a quick online search of Emma's social media, though her profiles were locked down tight with privacy settings. The twins, his sons. The words still felt surreal, like a dream he might wake from at any moment. But the business card Emma had reluctantly accepted before disappearing into her building sat on his nightstand, a tangible reminder that this was devastatingly, wonderfully real. He had written his personal cell number on it, not his business line, and told her he would come by in the morning. She hadn't agreed, but she hadn't refused either, and Alexander chose to interpret her silence as consent. Dawn broke over Manhattan in shades of pink and gold, and Alexander was already showered, dressed, and pacing his apartment like a caged animal. He had canceled his morning meetings, something he never did, and his assistant Jennifer had been too shocked to even question the decision. Alexander Harrington didn't cancel meetings. He didn't rearrange his schedule for personal matters. He certainly didn't show up to the office looking like he'd been awake all night, which is exactly how he knew he looked despite his expensive suit and carefully styled hair. He left his apartment at 7:30, knowing it was too early but unable to wait any longer. The drive to Queens felt interminable despite the relatively light traffic. Alexander's mind raced with questions, with accusations, with pleas he wasn't sure he had the right to make. Why had Emma left? Why had she kept the boys from him? What had he done to make her think he wouldn't want to know about his own children? The apartment building looked even more worn in the morning light, its brick facade crumbling in places, graffiti marking the walls near the entrance. Alexander's Mercedes stood out like a beacon of wealth in this neighborhood of modest sedans and aging minivans. He locked it carefully and approached the building, finding Emma's apartment number on the directory and pressing the buzzer. The intercom crackled to life, and Emma's voice came through, tight with tension and resignation. She had known he would come. Perhaps she had been awake all night, too, preparing for this confrontation, rehearsing explanations or excuses or whatever she planned to offer him. She buzzed him in without asking who it was, and Alexander climbed the stairs to the third floor, his heart pounding harder with each step. The hallway was clean but shabby, the carpet worn thin in places, the paint on the walls faded and chipped. This was where his sons lived. This was the home Emma had made for them while he had been living in luxury, completely unaware of their existence. He reached her door and raised his hand to knock, but it opened before his knuckles could connect with the wood. Emma stood in the doorway, and in the morning light, Alexander could see the toll the years had taken on her. She was still beautiful. She would always be beautiful to him. But there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there 6 years ago, a hardness born of struggle and sacrifice. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face free of makeup. She looked younger this way, more like the woman he remembered, but the guardedness in her expression aged her beyond her 29 years. Emma stepped back to let him enter, and Alexander found himself in a small but immaculately kept apartment. The furniture was secondhand but well-maintained, the walls decorated with the twins' artwork and family photographs that Alexander studied with hungry eyes. There they were at various ages, as babies, as toddlers, at birthday parties and parks and beaches. A chronicle of the life he had missed, displayed in cheerful frames that mocked him with their normalcy. The boys were not in the living room, and Alexander felt a pang of disappointment, so sharp it was almost physical. Emma must have seen it in his face, because she explained in a quiet voice that Noah and Ethan were still asleep. It was Saturday, she said, and she usually let them sleep in on weekends. The casual mention of their routine, of the life that went on without him, made Alexander's chest tighten. Emma gestured to the worn couch, and Alexander sat, feeling oversized and out of place in this modest space. Emma took the armchair across from him, perching on the edge as though ready to flee at any moment. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 6 years of unspoken words. Alexander broke it first, his voice rougher than he intended. He asked the question that had consumed him all night, the question that mattered more than any other. Why? Why had she left without telling him? Why had she kept his children from him? Why had she thought he wouldn't want to know? Emma's composure cracked, and for a moment, Alexander saw raw pain flash across her face before she controlled it. She stood abruptly and walked to the window, her arms wrapped around herself in a protective gesture he was beginning to recognize. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word landed like a hammer blow. She told him about discovering the pregnancy, about the joy and terror that had warred within her when she saw those 2 pink lines. She had been planning to tell him, had been rehearsing the words, imagining his reaction. And then she had seen the announcement in the newspaper, splashed across the society pages in bold print and glossy photographs. Alexander Harrington, heir to the Harrington fortune and CEO of Harrington Tech, was engaged to Victoria Ashford, daughter of Senator Ashford and darling of New York's social elite. The wedding was planned for the following spring. The merger of 2 powerful families, a match made in boardrooms and country clubs. Emma's voice broke as she described seeing that announcement, the way her world had shattered in an instant. She had thought what they shared was real, that the nights they spent together meant something beyond physical pleasure. But the engagement announcement told a different story. It told her she had been a fool, a diversion, a secretary who had mistaken her boss's attention for something more than it was. Alexander was on his feet before he realized he had moved, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to interrupt, to explain, but Emma wasn't finished. She turned from the window to face him, and the tears streaming down her face were like acid on his conscience. She told him about the decision she had made, sitting alone in her tiny studio apartment with a positive pregnancy test and a newspaper announcing his engagement. She could have told him about the babies, could have demanded support or acknowledgement. But she had known, or thought she knew, how it would go. His family would never accept her or her children. The Harringtons moved in circles where pedigree mattered, where the right schools and the right connections were everything. What was she? A secretary from a working-class background, a nobody with nothing to offer except two babies who would be seen as complications, embarrassments, threats to the perfect life Alexander was supposed to lead. So she had made what she thought was the merciful choice. She had disappeared, had moved to Queens where the cost of living was manageable, had worked multiple jobs while pregnant with twins, had built a life for her sons that didn't include the father who had never wanted them in the first place. The accusation in her final words struck Alexander like a physical blow. He sank back on the couch, his mind reeling, his carefully prepared arguments crumbling to dust. She had thought he didn't want them. She had thought he had used her while planning to marry someone else. She had thought his family would reject them. And worst of all, she had been partially right. Alexander's voice was hoarse when he finally found it. He told her the truth, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. The engagement to Victoria had been arranged by his father, a business merger disguised as a marriage. Alexander had agreed to it in a moment of weakness after Emma left, thinking that if he couldn't have the woman he loved, it didn't matter who he married. But he had been miserable. Victoria had been miserable. They had both known the engagement was a mistake, a bout of family pressure and social expectations that neither of them truly wanted. 2 months after Emma disappeared, Alexander had broken off the engagement, had endured his father's rage and his mother's disappointment, had walked away from the merger and the social advantages it would have brought. And he had searched for Emma. God, how he had searched. He had hired private investigators, had called every number he could find, had driven to her old apartment only to find new tenants who knew nothing about where she had gone. She had vanished completely, and Alexander had been left with nothing but regrets and unanswered questions. Emma was staring at him now, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. She shook her head slowly, as though trying to deny what she was hearing. She asked him why, if he had broken off the engagement, if he had been searching for her, why had he never found her? Why had she been able to disappear so completely? Alexander's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. He told her that she had been too good at hiding, that she had covered her tracks too well. She had quit her job without giving a forwarding address, had disconnected her phone, had moved without leaving a trace. And he had been looking in the wrong places, searching in Manhattan and the surrounding upscale neighborhoods, never imagining she would have moved to Queens, never thinking to look in the working-class areas where someone might actually be able to afford to raise children alone. The silence that fell between them was different now, charged with possibility and pain in equal measure. Emma sank into the armchair, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Alexander wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but he didn't know if he had the right. 6 years of separation couldn't be bridged in a single conversation, no matter how honest. A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. Small footsteps, the shuffle of children waking up and venturing out of their bedroom. Alexander's heart leaped into his throat as 2 identical faces appeared in the doorway, sleepy and confused, their dark hair sticking up at odd angles, their eyes, his eyes, blinking in the morning light. Noah and Ethan stared at the stranger in their living room, then at their mother who was clearly upset, then back at Alexander. One of them, Alexander still couldn't tell them apart. moved protectively toward Emma, while the other hung back in the doorway, curiosity warring with caution on his young face. Emma wiped her eyes quickly and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She held out her arms, and both boys came to her, pressing against her sides in that protective formation Alexander had seen yesterday. She told them that this was Alexander, that he was someone very important, that they needed to be polite and say good morning. The boys mumbled greetings, their voices shy and uncertain. Alexander felt his throat close up with emotion. These were his sons, close enough to touch, looking at him with innocent curiosity and no idea that he was their father. The weight of that knowledge, the responsibility it carried, threatened to overwhelm him. He managed to return their greeting, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. He asked them how they had slept, whether they were hungry, whether they liked pancakes. The mundane questions felt absurd given the magnitude of the situation, but they worked. The boys relaxed slightly, and the one who had hung back in the doorway ventured a small smile. Emma stood, clearly intending to usher the boys back to their room or two. Loving the twists? Subscribe so you never miss the next episode. The kitchen, anywhere away from this emotionally charged conversation. But Alexander stopped her with a gentle request. He asked if he could stay, if he could spend some time with them, if they could talk more after the boys at breakfast. Emma hesitated, her protective instincts clearly warring with something else. Perhaps fairness, perhaps recognition that Alexander had a right to know his children, perhaps simple exhaustion at carrying this burden alone for so long. Finally, she nodded, a small, reluctant gesture that nevertheless filled Alexander with hope. The morning that followed was surreal and wonderful and painful all at once. Emma made pancakes while Alexander sat at the small kitchen table with Noah and Ethan, answering their endless questions about his car, his suit, his watch. They were bright, curious boys, quick to laugh and generous with their smiles once they decided he wasn't a threat. Alexander learned that Noah was the more cautious one, thoughtful and observant, while Ethan was bold and adventurous, always ready to try something new. He learned that they loved dinosaurs and superheroes, that they were in kindergarten and learning to read, that their favorite color was blue and they wanted a dog, but Mommy said their apartment was too small. Every detail felt precious, a glimpse into the lives he should have been part of from the beginning. He watched Emma move around the kitchen, efficient and loving, and saw the mother she had become. She was patient with the boys' demands, firm when they tried to negotiate extra syrup, tender when Ethan spilled his juice and started to cry. After breakfast, the boys wanted to show Alexander their room, and Emma gave permission with visible reluctance. Alexander followed them down the short hallway to a small bedroom that held 2 twin beds, a shared dresser, and more toys than the space could comfortably accommodate. The walls were covered with posters and drawings, and Alexander recognized his own childhood interests reflected in their choices: space exploration, dinosaurs, adventure stories. Noah pulled out a book and asked Alexander to read it, and Alexander found himself sitting on the floor between the 2 beds with both boys pressed against his sides, their small bodies warm and trusting. He read about dragons and knights, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to choke him, and felt their weight against him like an anchor to a reality he had never dared to imagine. When the story ended, Ethan asked if Alexander would come back tomorrow. The innocent question hung in the air, and Alexander looked up to find Emma standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. He told Ethan that he would like that very much, if it was okay with their mother. Emma's eyes met his across the small room, and Alexander saw the fear there, the uncertainty, but also something that might have been hope. She told the boys that Alexander could visit again, that they would figure out a schedule, that things are going to be different now. The boys accepted this with the easy adaptability of children, already moving on to showing Alexander their favorite toys. But Alexander understood the weight of Emma's words, the promise and the threat they contained. Things are going to be different. He was going to be part of his sons' lives. The question was how, and what that would mean for all of them. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Alexander felt something shifting inside him. The anger and hurt from Emma's revelation hadn't disappeared. but it was tempered now by understanding. She had made her choices based on incomplete information, on fear and pain, and a desire to protect her children from rejection. They had both been victims of circumstance and miscommunication, of pride and assumptions that had cost them 6 years. When it was finally time for Alexander to leave, Noah and Ethan hugged him goodbye with an ease that broke his heart. They had accepted his presence in their lives with the simple trust of children who had been taught to see the good in people. Emma walked him to the door, and they stood in the hallway for a long moment, neither quite knowing what to say. Alexander broke the silence first. He told Emma that he wanted to be involved, that he wanted to be a real father to Noah and Ethan, not just a visitor or a source of financial support. He wanted to know them, to be part of their daily lives, to make up for the time he had lost. Emma's response was cautious, but not dismissive. She told him that they would take it slowly, that the boys' well-being had to come first, that she needed time to adjust to this new reality. But she also acknowledged that Alexander had a right to know his sons, that she had been wrong to keep them from him, even if her reasons had seemed valid at the time. They agreed that Alexander would visit again tomorrow, and the day after that, and as many days as his schedule allowed. They would figure out the logistics, the explanations, the legal arrangements later. For now, it was enough that he was here, that the truth was finally out, that the boys were beginning to know their father. As Alexander drove back to Manhattan, his mind was full of images from a morning. Noah's thoughtful questions, Ethan's infectious laughter, Emma's tentative smile when the boys had insisted Alexander stay for lunch. He had sons. He had a family, fractured and complicated as it was. And he had a second chance with Emma, though he didn't dare hope that she might still have feelings for him beyond co-parenting cooperation. The city skyline came into view, gleaming in the afternoon sun, and Alexander felt the weight of his responsibilities settling onto his shoulders. He would have to tell his mother, his business partners, his friends. He would have to figure out how to balance his demanding career with fatherhood. He would have to navigate the complex emotions between him and Emma, the hurt and betrayal on both sides that couldn't be resolved in a single morning. But as he pulled into his building's parking garage and killed the engine, Alexander found himself smiling. For the first time in 6 years, he had something to look forward to beyond the next business deal or quarterly report. He had Noah and Ethan, two beautiful boys who carried his blood and his features. He had Emma back in his life, even if their relationship was complicated and uncertain. And tomorrow, he would see them again. Tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day that Emma would allow. He would build a relationship with his sons, one story, one meal, one shared moment at a time. He would prove to Emma that he was serious about being a father, that he wouldn't disappear or lose interest when the novelty wore off. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and potential conflicts. But as Alexander rode the elevator up to his penthouse, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Real, tangible hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to be a family. The weeks that followed Alexander's discovery transformed into a delicate dance of boundaries and breakthroughs. True to his word, he appeared at Emma's apartment the next day, and the day after that, each visit carefully timed around the twins' schedule and Emma's work shifts at the medical billing company where she processed insurance claims. Alexander arrived with gifts at first, expensive toys that made Noah and Ethan's eyes light up with wonder, but made Emma's jaw tighten with discomfort. She pulled him aside after the third visit, her voice low but firm, and told him that the boys didn't need extravagant presents. They needed consistency, presence, a father who showed up not because he felt guilty, but because he genuinely wanted to be there. The criticism stung, but Alexander recognized the truth in it. He stopped bringing elaborate gifts and started bringing himself instead. His time, his attention, his genuine interest in the mundane details of his sons' lives. He learned that Noah loved building blocks and could spend hours constructing elaborate towers, his small face scrunched in concentration that reminded Alexander of himself during complex negotiations. Ethan preferred action, racing toy cars across the worn carpet with sound effects that grew louder and more elaborate as his confidence in Alexander's presence grew. Alexander found himself canceling meetings, rearranging conference calls, delegating responsibilities he had never trusted to anyone else. His assistant Jennifer watched this transformation with barely concealed shock, but she was efficient enough not to question the sudden shift in priorities. His business partners noticed too. Richardson commented during a board meeting that Alexander seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere even as they discussed the merger with a European tech firm that could expand Harrington Tech's global footprint exponentially. Alexander didn't tell them about the twins at first. The secret felt too precious, too fragile to expose to the harsh scrutiny of his business world. But he knew the revelation was inevitable, that eventually someone would see him in Queens or notice the changes in his behavior and start asking questions. He decided to tell his mother first, before the gossip mill could twist the truth into something ugly. Eleanor Harrington received the news in her Upper East Side townhouse, surrounded by the antiques and artwork that proclaimed her impeccable taste and old money pedigree. Alexander had rehearsed the conversation during the drive over, but all his careful words evaporated when he saw his mother's face, still beautiful at 62, her silver hair styled perfectly, her posture impeccable even in casual afternoon attire. He told her everything. About Emma, about the pregnancy she had hidden, about the engagement to Victoria that had driven Emma away, about the 2 5-year-old grandsons Eleanor didn't know existed. His mother's face went through a remarkable transformation. Shock, anger, disbelief, and finally something that might have been grief for the years she had lost. Eleanor's first instinct was exactly what Emma had feared 6 years ago. She demanded to know why Emma had kept the children's secret. What kind of woman would deprive a father of his sons, whether Emma was after money now that Alexander had found them? The accusations made Alexander's temper flare, and he defended Emma with a vehemence that surprised them both. He explained Emma's perspective, the engagement announcement that had shattered her trust, her belief that the Harrington family would reject her and the babies. Eleanor fell silent at that, her aristocratic features tightening with something that might have been shame. She asked if Emma had been wrong about that assessment, if the Harringtons would have welcomed an unplanned pregnancy with a secretary. Alexander couldn't answer, because they both knew the truth. 6 years ago, with his father still alive and the family's reputation paramount, Emma's fears had been entirely justified. But Eleanor surprised him. After a long silence, she asked to meet her grandsons. Not to judge, not to assess their suitability for the Harrington name, but simply to meet them. Alexander saw something in his mother's eyes he hadn't expected. Longing, perhaps, or the recognition of an opportunity to be better than she had been, to embrace these children despite the unconventional circumstances of their birth. The meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon at Emma's apartment. Eleanor arrived in a town car that drew stares from the neighbors, dressed in elegant casual, where that still managed to look like it cost more than Emma's monthly rent. Alexander watched nervously as his mother climbed the stairs, wondering if this had been a terrible mistake, if Eleanor would revert to type and say something cutting that would confirm all of Emma's worst fears. Emma answered the door with the twins flanking her, their small faces curious and slightly intimidated by this imposing stranger. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, her gaze moving from Noah to Ethan and back again, taking in every detail of their faces. Alexander saw his mother's composure crack, saw tears well in her eyes before she blinked them away. Eleanor knelt down, heedless of her expensive slacks on the worn carpet, and introduced herself to her grandsons. She told them she was their grandmother, that she had been waiting a very long time to meet them, that she hoped they might be friends. Her voice was gentle in a way Alexander rarely heard, stripped of its usual commanding tone. The boys warmed to her gradually, won over by her genuine interest in their toys and drawings, by the way she listened when they talked about kindergarten and their friends and the stray cat that sometimes appeared in the alley behind their building. Emma watched the interaction with visible tension, ready to intervene if Eleanor said or did anything to upset the twins, but the moment never came. When the boys ran off to their room to retrieve a particularly impressive Lego creation, Eleanor turned to Emma. Alexander braced himself for confrontation, But his mother surprised him again. Eleanor apologized. She told Emma that she understood why Emma had left, that she was sorry the Harrington family's reputation had been more important than Emma's well-being, that she regretted the years she had lost with her grandsons because of pride and social expectations. Emma's response was cautious but not cold. She thanked Eleanor for coming, for being kind to the boys, for not making this harder than it already was. The two women reached an understanding that day. Not quite friendship, but a mutual recognition that they both loved the twins and wanted what was best for them. Eleanor's acceptance made other things possible. Alexander began introducing the twins to his world gradually, taking them to child-friendly restaurants in Manhattan, to the park where they could run and play while he pushed them on swings and caught them at the bottom of slides. He attended their kindergarten events, the fall festival where Noah won a prize for his pumpkin decoration, the Thanksgiving play where Ethan forgot his lines but improvised with such enthusiasm that the audience laughed and applauded. Emma watched these outings with mixed emotions. She was grateful for Alexander's involvement, touched by his obvious devotion to the boys, but also terrified of what it might mean. He was introducing them to a world she could never provide, showing them possibilities that her modest income could never support. What would happen when the boys started to prefer their father's exciting outings to her quiet evenings at home? What would happen when they realized how different their lives could be? Alexander sensed her fears and tried to address them. He assured her that he wasn't trying to replace her or make her feel inadequate, that the boys loved her fiercely and nothing would change that. But his words couldn't entirely erase the anxiety that kept Emma awake at night, worrying about custody battles and legal rights and the possibility that Alexander, know someone who loves dramatic stories? Share this with them. Might decide he wanted the boys full-time. The proposal came 6 weeks after that rainy afternoon when Alexander had first seen his sons. They were sitting in Emma's living room after the twins had gone to bed, discussing the logistics of Thanksgiving. Alexander wanted the boys to spend it with his family. Emma wanted to maintain their traditions. The conversation had been going in circles when Alexander suddenly changed the subject. He asked Emma to marry him. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their directness. Emma stared at him, certain she had misheard, but Alexander's face was serious, his dark blue eyes intense with an emotion she couldn't quite read. He explained his reasoning with the same logical precision he brought to business negotiations. Marriage would give the twins legitimacy, would end any questions about their place in the Harrington family. It would provide security for Emma, ensure she never had to work multiple jobs or worry about making rent. They could present a united front to the world, could give Noah and Ethan the stability of a two-parent household. Everything he said made practical sense, but Emma heard what he didn't say. There was no mention of love, no declaration of feelings beyond co-parenting cooperation. This was a business arrangement, a merger of convenience designed to benefit their children. And the realization broke something inside Emma that she hadn't known was still intact. She refused. The word came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't soften it. She told Alexander that she wouldn't enter a loveless marriage, wouldn't pretend to feelings she didn't have just to give the boys legitimacy they shouldn't need. She had built a life for her sons based on honesty and love, and she wouldn't compromise that foundation with a lie, no matter how well-intentioned. Alexander tried to argue, his voice rising with frustration. He pointed out that they got along well, that they were both committed to the twins, that many successful marriages were built on less. He accused her of being impractical, of letting pride stand in the way of what was best for their children. The argument escalated until Emma asked him to leave, her voice cold with hurt and anger. Alexander went, but not before telling her that he wasn't giving up, that he would convince her eventually because it was the right thing to do. The tension between them affected the boys. Noah became clingy and anxious, while Ethan acted out at kindergarten, pushing another child during recess and earning his first ever disciplinary note. Emma and Alexander maintained a careful politeness during his visits, but the warmth that had been developing between them had frozen into something brittle and uncomfortable. Alexander threw himself into his work, trying to distract himself from the rejection that stung more than he wanted to admit. He told himself it was just practical disappointment, that he had proposed a sensible solution and Emma had been unreasonable to refuse it. But late at night, alone in his penthouse, he couldn't escape the truth. He had wanted her to say yes, not just for the boys, but for himself, because the weeks of being part of her life had reminded him of everything he had lost when she left. The news about the twins leaked 3 weeks after the failed proposal. Alexander never discovered who had talked. A business associate who had seen him with the boys, a neighbor from Emma's building who recognized him, someone from Eleanor's social circle who had heard about the grandsons. It didn't matter. Once the story broke, it spread through New York's social circles like wildfire. The headlines were brutal. Tech mogul's secret love children, Harrington heir's hidden family, from secretary to baby mama, the Emma Collins story. The tabloids dug into Emma's background, published photos of her modest apartment building, speculated about whether she had trapped Alexander deliberately or if he was being forced to acknowledge children that might not even be his. Emma's phone rang constantly with reporters requesting interviews. Photographers camped outside her building, making it impossible for her to take the boys to school without running a gauntlet of cameras and shouted questions. Her coworkers whispered when she walked by, and her supervisor called her into his office to discuss whether the media attention was affecting her job performance. Alexander tried to shield them, hiring security to keep the reporters at bay, issuing a statement through his publicist confirming that Noah and Ethan were his sons and that he was committed to being part of their lives. But the damage was done. Emma's privacy had been shattered, and the boys were confused and frightened by the strangers with cameras who followed them everywhere. Victoria Ashford called Alexander 3 days after the story broke. His ex-fiancee's voice was cool and controlled, but he could hear the hurt beneath it. She asked if the children had existed during their engagement, if he had been sleeping with his secretary while planning to marry her. Alexander told her the truth, that Emma had left before the engagement was announced, that he hadn't known about the pregnancy. Victoria's response was bitter. She told him that everyone in their social circle was laughing at the Harringtons, that his mother must be mortified, that Emma had played him perfectly by disappearing and reappearing with convenient airs just when his company was at its most valuable. The accusation infuriated Alexander, but he couldn't entirely dismiss it. The timing did look suspicious to outsiders who didn't know the full story. He found himself defending Emma to people who had never met her, explaining circumstances that sounded implausible even to his own ears. The stress affected his work. He snapped at his assistant, lost his temper during a board meeting, nearly walked away from a crucial negotiation because the other party made a snide comment about his situation. Emma bore the worst of it. The media attention was relentless, and the judgment from strangers was crushing. She received hate mail calling her a gold digger, a homewrecker, worst things she wouldn't repeat. Her landlord suggested she might want to find another apartment, somewhere the media circus wouldn't disturb the other tenants. The mother of one of Ethan's classmates pulled her son from playdates, citing concerns about the environment Emma's choices had created. Through it all, Alexander kept visiting, kept showing up for the boys, even when Emma made it clear she blamed him for the media exposure. He understood her anger, even shared it, but he refused to let it drive him away from his sons. He had missed 5 years of their lives. He wouldn't miss another day because of circumstances beyond his control. The crisis came on a Tuesday evening in late November. Noah had been fighting a cold for several days, but Emma had thought it was improving. She put the boys to bed as usual, checked on them before she went to sleep, and woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of Noah's labored breathing. She found him burning with fever, his small chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. Pneumonia, the emergency room doctor would later confirm, severe enough to require hospitalization. Emma rode in the ambulance with Noah while a neighbor stayed with Ethan, her hands shaking as she held her son's hand and whispered reassurances she didn't feel. She called Alexander from the hospital, her voice breaking as she explained what had happened. He arrived 20 minutes later, still in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair uncombed, his face pale with fear. He found Emma in the pediatric ward waiting room, and without thinking, she collapsed into his arms, all the anger and resentment forgotten in the face of their shared terror. They sat together through that endless night, taking turns at Noah's bedside while he slept fitfully, his small body fighting the infection that had invaded his lungs. Alexander held Emma when she cried, and she held him when the doctor delivered updates that were cautiously optimistic but not yet reassuring. They were just parents in that moment, stripped of their complicated history and uncertain future, united in their love for their son and their desperate hope that he would be okay. Noah's fever broke on the second day. The antibiotics were working, the doctor assured them, and while he would need to stay hospitalized for several more days, the worst was over. Emma and Alexander sagged with relief, and when Alexander pulled her into his arms again, Emma didn't resist. She let herself lean on him, let herself accept the comfort he offered, let herself remember what it had felt like 6 years ago when she had believed they could be something real. They talked during the long hours at Noah's bedside, really talked for the first time since Alexander's proposal. Emma admitted that she was terrified of losing the boys to Alexander's world, of becoming irrelevant in their lives once they realized how much more he could offer them. Alexander confessed that he was terrified of being shut out, of being relegated to weekend visits and child support payments, of never being more than a part-time father. The honesty between them was painful but necessary. They acknowledged the hurt on both sides. Emma's pain at being kept secret and then exposed to public judgment, Alexander's pain at missing 5 years and being refused when he tried to make things right. They talked about the proposal, and Alexander finally admitted what Emma had suspected. It hadn't been just about the boys. He had wanted to marry her, wanted to build a life with her, but he had been too afraid to admit it, too scared of being rejected if he offered his heart instead of just practical benefits. Emma's response was quiet but devastating. She told him that she had never stopped loving him, that leaving 6 years ago had nearly destroyed her, that seeing him again had reopened wounds she thought had healed. But love wasn't enough, she said. They had hurt each other too badly, kept too many secrets, built too many walls. How could they possibly build a marriage on that foundation? Alexander didn't have an answer, not then. But as they sat together in the hospital room, watching Noah sleep peacefully for the first time in days, he made a decision. He would prove to Emma that they could build something real, something lasting. Not through grand gestures or logical arguments, but through consistency, honesty, and time. When Noah was released from the hospital 5 days later, Alexander was there to drive them home. He carried Noah up the stairs while Emma held Ethan's hand, and he stayed to help settle Noah in a bed with extra pillows and the stuffed dinosaur that had been a gift from Eleanor. He made soup for dinner while Emma gave the boys their baths, and he read them both stories before tucking them in with kisses on their foreheads that felt natural and right. Emma walked him to the door, and they stood in the hallway for a long moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Alexander told her that he understood why she had refused his proposal, that he had been wrong to frame it as a business arrangement when it was so much more than that. He told her that he wanted to try again, to build a real relationship with her, to date properly, and see if they could recapture what they had lost. Emma's response was cautious, but not dismissive. She told him that she was willing to try, but slowly, with no pressure and no expectations beyond co-parenting. They would take it one day at a time, one conversation at a time, and see where it led. Alexander agreed, and as he drove home through the late November darkness, he felt something shift inside him. The fear and anger that had consumed him since finding his sons began to ease, replaced by something that felt like hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind born of panic and guilt, but the quiet, steady kind that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weeks that followed were different. Alexander still visited regularly, but now he and Emma made time to talk after the boys went to bed, sharing coffee and conversation in her small living room. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, the paths that had led them to each other and then apart. They talked about the future too, carefully, tentatively, but with increasing honesty about what they wanted and feared. Alexander took Emma on their first official date in early December, a quiet dinner at a restaurant far from the social circles where they might be recognized. They talked for hours, and when he walked her to her door, he kissed her good night with a tenderness that made her heart ache. It felt like a beginning, fragile and uncertain but real. The twins' 6th birthday approached, and Alexander and Emma planned the party together, a small celebration at Emma's apartment with a few of the boys' kindergarten friends. Eleanor came, bringing gifts that were thoughtful rather than extravagant, and she helped Emma in the kitchen with an ease that surprised them both. Alexander watched his mother and the mother of his children working side by side, and felt something settle in his chest. This was what family looked like, imperfect and complicated but genuine. On the morning of the party, as Emma decorated the living room with streamers and balloons, Alexander pulled her aside. He told her that he loved her, that he had never stopped loving her, that he wanted to build a life with her and their sons. He wasn't proposing, he assured her, just being honest about his feelings and his hopes for their future. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling as she told him that she loved him too, that she was terrified but willing to try, that maybe they could build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. They kissed in the kitchen while the twins played in the living room, and it felt like coming home. The party was chaotic and wonderful, full of laughter and cake and presents. As Alexander watched Noah and Ethan blow out their candles, surrounded by family and friends, he felt a contentment he had never experienced in all his years of business success. This was what mattered, these people, this moment, this imperfect but precious family they were building together. That night, after the guests had left and the boys were asleep, Alexander and Emma sat on the couch, surrounded by wrapping paper and empty plates. Emma leaned against his shoulder, and Alexander wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They didn't talk about the future or make promises they weren't sure they could keep. They simply sat together in the quiet apartment, listening to the city sounds outside and the peaceful breathing of their sons down the hall, and let themselves believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. Don't forget to turn on notifications. More intense stories are coming. If you made it to the end of this emotional roller coaster, you're exactly the kind of person we love having here. Like this story, subscribe for more. Share with someone who loves a good twist. And come back to this channel for more unforgettable stories.